I coined enchantivism because I noticed that there were a lot of people in the world doing really change-making things, not just to create hope or anything like that, but they were actually doing it in situations of rupture and darkness, where they would say, but look what we can do with this. Sometimes things happen informally when people recognize we're both human beings and we have some common ground. Broadcasting those kinds of situations is what I think of as enchantivism.
Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't.
My name is Kira Epstein. I'm the co-director of the New School at Commonweal. We are delighted to have with us today the first visiting scholar at the New School at Commonweal, Craig Chalquist. Most of you maybe met him a couple weeks ago when we had our first introductory event where he started a conversation about dreams and imagination and story and how they can help us to have a different worldview, maybe a more earth-centered worldview. That conversation continues today with him talking with our new school host, Susan Grelock Yusem. Since this is a conversation about land and the earth and people and our connection, I want to read Commonweal's Earth Attribution. Commonweal sits in a place we now call Bolinas and Point Reyes Peninsula. The land where we come together to learn and celebrate was, for thousands of years, the home of the Coast Miwok people. Many of us are wandering people. We come from many cultures. Many of them were disrupted and destroyed. We are now fortunate enough to be the stewards of this piece of land under our feet. We recognize that this is holy ground. We honor the Miwok elders, past and present. May our words and visions join with those of the ones who came before us and be medicine for the brokenness of time, place, and peoplehood. Dr. Craig Chalquist and Dr. Susan Grelock Yusem, welcome to the New School at Commonweal.
Welcome, Craig.
Thank you.
It's great to be here. I'm Susan, as Kira said. I'm the head of strategy at Commonweal and also a community psychologist, trained in the depth psychology tradition that Craig is in. And we have a really wonderful topic for the next hour, very evocative, talking about dreaming the soul of the earth. We can unpack that and consider what that might mean. Before we dive in, many people at the New School who come to our events understand what depth psychology is, but I think it's very different in our Western psychological tradition that tends to be rooted in cognitive behavioral and clinical psychology. Just to ground everyone in our wider audience, can you say a little bit about what depth psychology is and what it means to be a depth psychologist?
Thanks, Susan. We tend to work on the humanities side more than on the physical science side of the house. You probably all know there's a split that runs through psychology itself that way, and it's the physical science side that's the loudest at the moment, culturally. So in depth psychology, we're always wondering what's going on, not just between conscious and unconscious, but also under the surface of events. And some years ago when I was a student, James Hillman, the depth psychologist, came to talk at Pacifica, and he sat down facing an audience, and he asked all the students, so what is depth? And we were all thinking, we didn't know there was going to be a quiz. So there were various answers, but what they often came down to was we treat events, including internal events, something like symbols, images, symptoms of something that's going on underneath the surface in consciousness itself, whether that's personal or collective. And we're fascinated by that. We're the irritating people that always go, well, what does it mean? That doesn't mean anything. Well, yeah, it does. So we use a lot of humanities-based techniques like interpretation, tending the image, letting it breathe, letting it deepen into our experience, things like that. And academically, the tradition goes back to even before Freud. He's usually the first person who gets mentioned. And depth psychology was actually coined to describe Freud's way of working with the psyche. But he studied with Pierre Janet, who had his own fully informed depth system, even called it a name, psychological analysis. So Freud called his psychoanalysis. What a coincidence. Carl Jung, Tony Wolff, Emma Young, Anna Freud, those are all origin names at the beginning of the tradition, and it's gone on for hundreds of years in different directions. So.
Yeah, it's worth noting in other cultures like Latin America and parts of Europe, it's very much alive as the core vein of psychology, very little different than our North American context right now. Well, nice that you evoked Hillman too, because there's a depth within the New School of recordings that Michael Lerner has done about Hillman. So there's a beautiful archive there for people that want to dig deeper in. Something you brought up about the tending, the way that a depth psychologist tends to the living image. I think that's going to be like a important part of this conversation when we think about dreaming with the earth and what does that look like, and what does it look like in our lived experience and our embodied experience. So let's just jump into that idea. I mean, when you say dreaming with the land, what does that mean, and how is it different than like dreaming about land? Like, what is the distinction there?
I think it can include about land, but that's what we usually think of it in terms of like when we dream about a specific place. But there's something that Jung noticed. It's one of his really marvelous magical ideas or observations, actually. He noticed that the psyche, that consciousness, can take just about any experience and turn it into some kind of a figure or a character or an image. And so Jung called that personification. And so in the work that I've been doing for, I can't believe it's been like 25 years now, we're really interested in this because personification is a bridge to the places where we live and work and even started out. In fact, we often find that there are dream characters who don't neatly reduce down to our usual ways of thinking about dream characters as parts of us, right? This is kind of my shadow side, and this is kind of my this side and that side, and those are in there. Those dream characters exist. But what we've learned is that that the spirit of place, whatever that means, somehow shows up as a dream character. That would be one example of dreaming with the land. So asking it, tending it, once we're awake, what is it you're reaching out to me for? What is it that you would like to tell me? And I actually have not that recent, but a couple of years ago, there was one that stands out for me at the moment. I had to go through a year of helping my mother sell her house and move into assisted living, and that was really hard. She had lived in that house since before I was born, and I grew up in it. When I was adopted, I came home to that house. So for both of us, it had a lot of meaning. My dad died in that house. So even though by the time I was 18, I couldn't wait to get out of it, it was always kind of this psychological anchor the whole time. So around the time we sold the house and she moved into assisted living, I dreamed that there was a woman who was about, I'm guessing 66, 67 years old. And I was standing in the backyard of the old house with her. And she said, "Take a look around." And so by whatever logic dreams operate, I was able to see the entire neighborhood from the backyard, which I normally wouldn't be able to. And it was like a last look, and it felt that way in the dream, like I was saying goodbye. And I told her thank you, and I woke up. And it occurred to me upon reflection that the woman was the same age as the neighborhood. And based on my work and with personification, terrapsychology, and all that, I realized she was the neighborhood. However that shows up, the spirit of place itself often visits us that way. And I tend not to be very metaphysical about it. I tend to think of it in terms of shared experience, and I could go into that a little bit more, like what's happening there. But it felt to me like the spirit of that place knew we were leaving. And it gave us both, when I told my mother about it too, a chance to say goodbye. So we've collected, I don't know how many hundreds of dreams like that. And when these personifications tell us things, we follow up. And that's part of working with the dream of earth and place too. Taking the message seriously enough to find out, like if I dreamed before visiting San Luis Obispo that there was a terrible pollution problem there. A figure in a dream told me that. And when I went there, I saw that there was. So tending what those voices tell us in dreams. And also, Hillman keeps popping up. He refers a lot to...
He's mischievous that way.
He sure is, yeah. He was like, well, that's a longer story. I knew Hillman, not well, but I knew him. He was mischievous, he was a trickster. He talks a lot about, and I think he got this from Margot, from his wife. He married an artist, and
Margot McLeod, he wrote Dream Animals with her. It's a really beautiful book.
Yeah, it is. She taught him how to notice details, the details that make for life, the little things. How to have a more embodied experience of the world. What do things actually smell like? What do they actually look like? What colors are mixed in here? And I think that's a way we tend to dream of the world too. And then the last thing I'll say is, in many mythologies, the world is dreaming. Yurok have a story about a whale that communicates in dreams when she sleeps, and we've probably, most of us or all of us, have heard of Australian Aboriginal culture about the dream time, and it's an image that pops up a lot in people's folklore. So dreaming in that sense too, just wading in, you know.
So to take dreaming is often a way for us to animate the world and make that connection you just did. But then there's also, and you brought it up with Hillman and Margot's work, because in Dream Animals, they talk about the fox under, Margot always makes a point, not just the dream fox, there's a fox under your porch and it's real.
Right.
And how do you live with the understanding of the fox under your porch and what it means and who it is and its embodiment of soul and its soul making.
Yeah.
So because we're here thinking about how we animate this in our current culture, especially as it could be a really important capacity or tool for this times that we're navigating, I'm thinking about like the tradition, like in Western culture with like Hestia, or like this understanding in Greek culture of animation in a home, for example, and that there were gods who were tended in like a lintel, a door, a window, everything was animated as a living practice. And we don't tend to have that anymore. But Jung had mentioned that too, about, there's a story about he left his castle for a while, his tower, and when he came back, the kitchen was angry and the pots were clanking and the spoons were giving him a hard time because he
That's
did
a great
live.
story. I love
he lived
that.
he built that house with that and lived in it. So can you say a little bit about, like, I know you're a deep student of myth. Can you talk a little bit about that in our own Western culture, of like how that has emerged and what it looked like?
It's funny how many things are alive in our old stories. And even some of the recent ones too. There's a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale where there's a man who's quite evil to people, and the things in his life turn against him. He has needles that stab him, and stuff falls on him when he goes into his house and things like that. It makes me wonder, there's a comment that Jung makes about the unconscious. It turns toward us the face that we turn toward it. When we suppress what's inside of us, when we fight with it, when we argue with it, it tends to come back at us through symptoms, through strange things that happen on the outside as well as the inside. But if we tend it more carefully, if we tend things more carefully, they treat us differently. Speaking of Jung, he would, like all of us, he would occasionally lose things, and so he got a phrase from one of his schizophrenic patients who, when he lost, I think it was a pipe, he smoked a lot, and he couldn't find it, and he was cursing about it, and the patient said, "It's been magicked away." And so forever after, Jung would say that when he had his patients in his office, can't find that damn pipe. It's been magicked away. It'll come back when it's ready to. And so I mean, even in the West, there's a long tradition of animistic perception. It's called different things: pan-experientialism, panpsychism. It goes all the way back, and it doesn't mean rocks think. it means everything has a presence, an interiority of some kind. And I treat it playfully. I used to own an old Subaru I bought from a friend, and it was such a beater. But it got me all over California when I was doing research for the depth psychology PhD. I was looking at what happened in California when it was colonized and talking to a lot of people about who, including original people who lived here before, and what do they think and how do they feel. And so anyway, that car got me all over the place, even though it felt like it was always ready to die. And there was a loose speaker wire on the passenger side, so the speaker would hum every now and then, and I would talk back. So we'd be out driving, and the speaker would hum, and I'd go, "Oh, pretty good. How are you doing today? What do you think of this trip?" And just for fun. So when we finished the research trip, I pulled into my driveway of the place where I was living at the time, and the car died. And I wanted to hug the car. I should have. Thank you for getting me all over that. Thousands of miles, And it was dead as a doornail at that point, so yeah. But I mean, what would happen if just playfully, it's not a matter of believing anything, just playing with things, What does it mean when we lose something? What does it mean when the door's stuck? What's the door think about this? And you mentioned earlier too about, to put it a little bit differently than how you said it, but like not always assuming that the symbol or the event or whatever is only about us, but that it's got a root in the world, Years ago, I had a dream of about manatees who were dying off, and the first thing I did when I woke up was to check how they were doing, and they were in bad shape, and I hadn't known that consciously. So a dream like that helps connect me to the ecological world as well if I take it seriously, and I'm sure it has other meanings on top of it. But
Yeah, I had the same thing because my research was around wolves, and it began with a wolf appearing in a dream and trying to understand what that wolf what was happening with wolves. They were not in my consciousness, and then understanding them in their lived experience opened up quite like a rich body. So if we are trying to cultivate that, like you talk about place-based dream work, if we're trying to do an imaginal work with our dreams and cultivate that connection, what could it look like? Like how do you do that? Very American question. How do you do it? What do we do? We just do something.
5 steps. So maybe an example from a specific place might work. It was actually how I got onto all this 25 years ago. I was born in San Diego, and I grew up in the East County, and so then went off to college. And I had recently returned when I was a graduate student, trying to figure out what I was going to do my dissertation on. Had no idea, and the deadline was coming up. So, how to say this concisely? There were dreams in which San Diego appeared as a personified figure for me, and told me things like, you need to go over to this part of the city and look at this, and you need to check into my history, and actually talking to me in the dreams. And I'd been doing dream work for some time at that point, but I didn't have any way of understanding this because I didn't grow up animistically. So, I tried to use the usual, like, this is a part of me talking, all that stuff, and it just fell completely flat. And I was talking to Hillman about it once, and he said, well, maybe the question is, what kind of anima is California? So in other words, if we think of anima as part of a man's mind, as Jung kind of literalistically put it, what if we reversed it and thought of some of these interior figures as saying something to us from the places themselves, right? So I decided to do, and I still do this when I move somewhere different, I decided to do a place history instead of a case history. My background's in psychotherapy, and so I know how to do case histories, but I thought, what if San Diego were my client? What would I learn if I looked for themes that run through not only the history of the city, but start in the land itself? And San Diego's a deeply divided place in the sense that there are canyons right in the heart of the city. And it's, of course, a border town. It's also ecologically a border. There's all these edgy things that happen with San Diego, and so it starts running like a theme throughout the history of the place. So I always start with the land.
And saying it out loud, like hearing you, like there's canyons through the heart of San Diego.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, when you think about it and hold it poetically, it starts to give you a sense of San Diego's personality or its spirit or its soul.
Yeah.
So like that's like a core idea of the terrapsychology. I think it's worth going into a little more. I think it's a useful thing because I do it sometimes as an exercise, something people can actually do. Like if you show up in a neighborhood or a place or even a new house, like someone's house, to hold it in that way, like you might hold another person when they're trying to explain to you their psychological experience. You're listening to them, or you're looking at them, or you're like in a city, you look at the signs. If you change your orientation and start like, what kind of cars are there? What are the colors? Like, what do the billboards say? What are the images are there a lot of like winged beings on billboards?
Yeah.
Why? Like, what does it mean?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little more about that actual terrapsychological practice? Because it's kind of powerful. I think it does actually change your own way of orienting in your own life.
Yeah. I look for not just repeating themes, but also, what's a good example? I go way back into prehistory. Before I visited Ireland, I was curious about the geology, because from a terrapsychological perspective, geology is psychology in a very deep way. Instead of being in that paradigm of we have to prove that this influences that, that a place or features of it affect human psychology, we just start from that assumption. We don't split them because there's an inherent split in that way of thinking and researching. So I was interested in Ireland because I was going there for the first time to co-lead one of the facilitators of an eco-spiritual retreat there. And I came across something that startled me at first. It was that Ireland starts out as two islands. Many millions of years ago, it was closer to the equator, and Northern Ireland roughly, not perfectly, but roughly corresponds with the newer chunk of geology that existed, more volcanic, more eruptive. And then Ireland, the Republic, is more, it was originally from Gondwana land, the supercontinent, and it has a different texture to the stone itself. And so there was a bridge of water between the two, the Iapetus Sea, and then over millions of years, the two fused. And so, then it allows you to ask questions like, well, how does this play out in human culture in a place like this? Or how does it affect me when I actually land there? Where am I living this split that's being synthesized somehow, this joining of two things that felt separate? And there were a lot of experiences like that there. And when I brought this up to people who live in Ireland, they resonated with it. It made sense to them. So I'm looking for things like that. And I think it's often reflected unconsciously in things like civic art. Mm-hmm. I always look at the monuments and the buildings.
And graffiti.
Yeah. I remember, this is probably more subjective than anything, but when I first went to Sacramento, which is named Sacrament after the fact that when Spanish settlers went there, the tribes that were living there at the time were butchering fish for the winter stores. So there was a lot of blood laying around, and it reminded the Spanish soldiers of the blood of Christ. So they called it Sacramento. But there is, in fact, a lot of underworld themes that play out in Sacramento. In fact, the tribes that were there, when they realized that settlers were coming in, they pointed to some of the trees and they said, "Do you see those white rings about a dozen feet off the ground? Those mean something." And the settlers went, "Oh, they don't know what they're talking about," until the winter floods came, which is why there are now levees all around the city. It's a literal underworld. There are a huge number of cemeteries behind the Capitol building. So I was standing, I forget the name of the street. If anybody knows, call it out. But it's a big avenue where you can see that huge gold-colored gate at one end and the Capitol's at the other end. And I'm standing there, and there's this row of tall buildings on either side, and the temperature was about 500 degrees. I made the mistake of going in the summer. And I was thinking about all that history, and I said, this feels like standing in hell, which was, of course, subjective, but hellish temperature anyway. But there are these themes that repeat if you're looking for that. And so that's one of the ways I study places. And I also look for them in my dreams, like I mentioned earlier.
And that idea with the place with Sacramento really enriches your sense of the Sacramento itself as the seat of our government in California. So it's like it gives you a richer background for understanding or holding how things move through even our state.
The capital itself moved a few times. It was San Jose and Benicia. I think it should have stayed in Benicia, but very different place, different presence. But there were politicians in Sacramento that they actually broke into the old Capitol at one point, stole all the records, and sailed to Sacramento on a ship whose name was Empire. Sailed to the underworld. I'm like, God, this just explains so much about our state, you know. At least its origin, not, you know. But
I was thinking about eco-grief and this time when there's so much grief on a personal level, on a cultural level, on a planetary level. You know, like some of us might go back to where we were born and see that the forest isn't there anymore that we played in as a child, or the river's polluted, or we're just watching neighborhoods change, and then understanding the very real dynamics of the planet. And what does healing look like when the wounds are at all of these dimensions? Like, how does one even hold it? I think a lot of people are overwhelmed by it at this stage. So when the wounds are at all those levels, how does one even attempt healing?
I have to confess that I've stopped thinking about it in terms of healing because, and this is just for me, other people might find it meaningful to keep doing that, but I feel so continually torn open by what happens to all these places. I can't even think about healing. And for a lot of us, it starts early. There was a beloved meadow where I used to fly kites with my friends when I was a kid, and it got paved over, and now it's a highway patrol station. So that was the first really, I think, significant ecological loss. And I still feel sad for the place. I wonder what's happening under the concrete and things like that. But I think, first of all, to normalize that, I've talked to psychotherapists who say that their clients come in just shedding copious tears about this particular place or the state of the planet itself and what we're doing to it or what have you. And they're afraid to talk about it because our culture doesn't really make room for that kind of grief. We always expect grief to be personal, which of course it certainly is sometimes. But so I would say it helps to normalize it, to know that many people are responding that way. I would say everybody is at some level, even if they're just unconscious of it. When Linda Bizel and I teach or present on ecotherapy, we'll sometimes mention that symptoms we think are personal are connected to eco-grief. And people we talk to will often say, oh, I had no idea it had that connection, but now it makes sense. Now I can actually feel it instead of having a symptom about it. So I think something moves when we do that. Maybe it's healing in the sense of understanding why we feel this way, and that being an impetus to join up with other people who do also.
And how does that relate to how one might hold the shadow in their own work? Like, how does one hold how might you think of the collective shadow and your own personal shadow around eco-grief and that wounding?
The cultural shadow is the one that first comes to mind, although the personal one's there too. But everything we've been talking about around this is in the personal, in the collective shadow, and we feel it personally. Marie-Louise von Franz talked a lot about the relationship between the two, that when we haven't really worked with our own dark side much, it leaves a door open in the psyche in the back, and all the collective stuff comes swarming through, which we're now seeing politically as well, right? So the big shadow. So, but I don't think I'm getting to what you're asking.
Well, there's so much going on. Some of us are just tuning it out, and there's shadowy things we don't even want to hear anymore. And how do we actually deal with that without them getting bigger and bigger and blowing up in our face? Like, how do we even hold or integrate shadowy material in the culture in a way that, like, how do we do it in a way that we can actually integrate it and let it in?
I think part of it is doing it together, because the trauma that we're facing right now is so much larger than anything anyone else has ever had to face, that it is, in a sense, it's impossible to take on. So I'm thinking of networks like Good Grief and other organizations that do that kind of work. It's one of the things I've spent some years cautioning activists about is that, since they've been living with this, sometimes they're much more aware of the dynamics of this shadow material than the rest of us are. But if they don't know much about how the psyche works, they tear those wounds open in a good intentioned attempt to warn people about how serious this all is. And any good-hearted person in a disaster will tell you there's a disaster happening and we need to do something about it. But given the nature of psychological defense, I think most of us just change the channel when that happens. And I think it's because we have nowhere to put it. There needs to be some kind of container for that magnitude of grief.
And does this connect into your interest now in enchantivism and this idea of re-enchanting our experience with the world? Can you talk about that piece?
Yeah. For some years, I've been concerned that all we hear is the bad news, and of course we need to know it, no question about it. But, and I wish I could have talked to Hillman about this. This is where we squarely disagree. Hillman's idea about hope is that it's always an evasion. We need to live without hope. It can, and sure, that false hope can definitely be that. It can be a form of denial. But it seems like, for most of us anyway, if you don't give people something to look forward to, or some possibility of making something beautiful come out of disaster, then it's very difficult for them to integrate all this and live with it. Some of us can. I grew up in a violent home. I spent my whole first 18 years being totally hopeless. I learned that really early, because any time it looked like things were going to shift, they wouldn't. It would just be worse. So I understand what it feels like to be able to live without hope. But I think for the majority of people, at least after a while, it becomes impossible to do anything constructive. So I coined enchantivism because I noticed that there were a lot of people in the world doing really change-making things, not just to create hope or anything like that, but they were actually doing it in situations of rupture and darkness, where they would say, but look what we can do with this. And it would bring new things. I think of all the time of, in this connection, of Jacqueline Susskind, who's a poet. I think she still lives in Arcata. But she was writing street poetry at one point, and a guy came up and said, and paid her and said, I'd like a poem for my wife who just died. And so she wrote a poem for this man, and then they struck up a conversation. And it turned out he was an executive officer in a logging company that was about to log down a stand of trees that she, as an activist, was trying to protect. So they became friends informally. And so he ended up seeing her point, and he actually got permaculture training after that. What a change, And it was a creation of informal relationships. So there's absolutely a place for protest and all kinds of political action and things like that. But sometimes things happen informally when people recognize we're both human beings and we have some common ground. So broadcasting those kinds of situations is what I think of as enchantivism. And I collect examples of it. So if you ever want them, email me. My website's chalquist.com, and I'll send you the list.
So is enchantivism about highlighting the magic that we see? So we start to realize there's more of it and it's happening all over? It's not just some fluke event or...
Yeah. And it's very different from positive thinking, which I'm kind of cynical about. Well, look at where I came from, right? But it's more about, I think of the Civil War in El Salvador, and the people who set up camps for joy committees, right, in the camps. So it's like that. It's like, what did Camus say? Being able to remain on that dizzying crest. That is integrity, and the rest is subterfuge. Dancing on the crest. It's those doctors, those Persian doctors from Iran who were, during COVID, they were chanting Rumi in the operating rooms. That's enchantivism. Things that show us that we're better than the news depicts us as. One of the things that Abraham Maslow said a long time ago that I firmly agree with is that human nature is sold short. In a way, we only see the shadow side, because that's the side that gets the press, right? But what about the people who are doing magnificent, beautiful things in the world? What about them?
So you're getting at storytelling, and there's a lot of talk in different spaces about story and storytelling. And one of the things that occurs to me about storytelling is that there's a listener. And so sometimes is it not necessarily even just the narrative itself, but that in fact storytelling is a way that humans connect across identity or things, and we connect in a different way. And that partly what storytelling might be doing is weaving the web of humanity, which gives us like a safety net so that when things are tumultuous around us, we still have this sort of resonant linkages with each other. Can you talk about story? Like, how do you feel story works us?
It's so much more of a profound way to connect than just debate or facts or figures or lectures, which have their place. But I mean, there's a lot of research, neuroscientific research on how even across ideologies and cultures, when we're all listening to a story together, our brains synchronize. There are things that we can hear through story that we can't hear straight up sometimes. There's many examples from indigenous cultures whose elders, instead of shaming and confronting somebody with an injustice that they've done, say, that reminds me of a story. And then they depict something similar and just leave it for people to interpret on their own. My grandfather, he was not indigenous, but he did that to me once when I set part of my high school on fire. I was very angry and getting beat up at home and at high school both. So that was one of the things I did. And he was asking about, he said, I understand why you retaliated, but what was the gain in retaliating? And I said, I can't think of one. And he said, in revenge, there never is one. And I never forgot that. And then he told a story to go along with it. So there's ways stories reach us that official minuted meetings don't. When I have to have difficult conversations with people at work, we go for walks or find some other setting that's less than formal. I can't think of an example of where official business ever accomplished anything. I'm sure there are some, but it's official business and committees and things like that. They're great for status quo. They're great for keeping things going the way that they're going. They're terrible for innovation, oftentimes anyway. So story is, I think it's basic to who we are. I went through a period when I first started studying psychology many years ago where I thought of us as kind of fancy circuitry, and then that wore off pretty quickly. And then I thought in terms of Jungian terms, complexes and archetypes and things like that, which are still a part of what I like to write and teach. But as time goes on, I think more and more that we're made of stories. And it's one of the reasons that I spend so much time on trying to change our guiding stories. I call them keystone fictions. Because if you change the guiding story, everything built on top of it changes. How you perceive things, your relationships, your values, your politics, everything. So for me, that's the point of activity.
And the thing I think we might overlook about story that I think like Martin Shaw, the mythologist, is really good at doing is, and people do with their dreams when they take the Hillman approach, like when there's animation and things are arriving, you're working with them or understanding them. In a story, there's all these, in like traditional storytelling, it's not like a straight narrative. Like American movies might be. It's like there's a lot of people doing a lot of crazy things, like in a dream, and because you repeat them traditionally, you see yourself at different characters at different times.
Yeah.
So the story itself is like an ecosystem or an ecology, and when you tell it, you hear it differently every time over the years, and you're like, oh, I'm the cat this time, or no, I'm the grandmother, or I'm the bucket, or can you say a little that, like the living aspect? I think that's something that doesn't always get attention of like, because it's that way of holding a dream and that way of holding story, which is very archetypal and very like, I think, and very much resonate with Hillman's work around the living archetypes and how they're in the room with you all the time, and how that might be how you would encounter a place.
That's a big question.
Okay.
I'll
Go
try
wherever
it,
you want. Pick whatever thread.
That's a great question. I was really happy in my family systems training years ago when we got to the part about family roles and how families are one mind. And I've been studying Jung on the slide because they didn't mention Jung in therapy school at all, the one I went to. And so I was reading about these recurring characters that show up in myth and fiction. And then I was at school studying family systems about there's a hero and there's an outsider. And at the same time, I was just getting to know my birth family. I'm adopted. And it really helped to know that my mother was the family outsider. And my uncle, who was suspicious at me at first because I just kind of popped up out of nowhere after they had all been told I died at birth. And who is this guy, you know? But he and I had both been raised to be the, quote, family hero, you know, that irritating person that can do no wrong until they do, you know? So we hit it off right away because our roles were so similar. And I think that was part of it. So there are stories that replay at home, in the office, in relationships. And, you know, our usual way of understanding projection when it's described simply as there's something I don't like in me that I put on you instead. But that's a really limited way of holding it. We recreate whole family situations with each other all the time in relationships, and the person might change. You know, you're mad at them one moment because they're your angry mother, and then you're mad at them tomorrow because they're more like your dad, you know. But they shift. And so we're always in these dramas. The drama doesn't stay in the theater. And they have deep roots also in our mythologies. There's recurring characters there. Be interesting to study mythology from a family systems point of view. I don't know if that's been done.
But no, like in our own experience, we can think about like at different times in your life in the family play, you resonate with different archetypes, and people change archetypes a little bit.
Yeah.
Like it's not a static thing. I mean, unless the family is just that locked down. But like in an evolving family, maybe you resonate more with your heroic father, but then all of a sudden you realize your mother was heroic, and then you feel different energies through it. So it is a living story, and you can move around and identify with different characters, and even like in the family story.
Yeah, family therapists actually use that as a criterion for health. If you can change roles, if you know you were the outlaw for a while, what does it feel like to be the hero or the heroine? If you can do that, then your family's pretty flexible, and they might push back a little bit. All families do, but and the same with organizations. Some of the rigid ones try to lock people into single roles.
Yeah.
And if the role suits you, that's fine. But you know, when people get put in roles that don't really suit them, because on the inside they're different and they're trying to be something they're not, then there's a problem. But
no, that's a great example. And maybe before we have to wrap up, to expand a little more to thinking about the land. As you were talking, I was remembering a few days ago, we had a writing retreat here at Commonweal at the Garden with Dr. Anna O'Malley, who's here. And she runs Natura, which is a Commonweal program. And we were waiting for more of the people to come, and we were sitting in the Commonweal Garden, which has many stories, you know, in the land. And we just organically started sharing stories of animals. Stories of a fox that I bumped into in a tree, and Anna had stories of the bunnies and skunks babies running around. And I was just thinking about that. It was a very organic thing to be there. I mean, it's a very carefully thoughtfully tended place. So that is just there. It naturally happened just sitting there. And we just started animating the land. And that was like a beautiful way to enter that day which we had devoted to writing and the imaginal. And I'm wondering like how we go home, we have places we live, some are, wilder than others, some are very tended, some are urban. So how do we, what are ways we can hold that capacity or just consciously animate the land in our own psyche together?
Yeah, curiosity, looking at it with fresh eyes. Who is here? Who is doing what here? There's this cast of characters where I live that I'm familiar with because I go outside and listen and watch them. And I was working out the other day, I kind of overdid it, and I went outside and the lizard that I often see came up on the step below me and started doing push-ups. I thought, you do those. I've done enough of those, So they're there. There's a collared Eurasian dove family that lives up in the rafters. I love their songs. So I try to listen, like what emotions do these characters and their behavior evoke in me and the music of it, And pretty soon you realize you've entered what a lot of us call the great conversation that's more than human. Most of what's out there doesn't speak directly to us, although it occasionally does. Like when you're out walking through a forest and the signal bird up in the trees lets the other birds know that you're coming. And of course the tree, the soil fungi knows you're there. But a lot of the conversations are much larger than we are. And I try to get a sense of what the mood is of a place today. Sometimes it's more somber, sometimes it's more joyful, especially when, certain kind of, I'm thinking of California towhees also, but certain ones come out and they're just really musical on a particular day. So I listen to that. And then knowing something about the history of the place and who was there before, things like that. And then I also, sometimes I'll visualize a place when I'm going to sleep and ask for it to show up in my dreams. And it often does, in personified form or otherwise. So the conversation can continue.
So I was thinking when you were talking, well, then maybe that's easy to do it at home or in a garden, but then when you come into a workplace or a community setting
Yeah.
And I thought, actually, when I was preparing the question in my mind, I remembered a number of years ago, they were doing the hearings in California for wolves to understand endangered species protection. And I went to the hearing and I stood up and I remember just telling a story about being in Yellowstone and I remembered the board of supervisors actually looking up.
Yeah.
And someone pulled me aside from one of the nups, they actually listened.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, yeah, they listened. So it was bringing the wolves into a room in a hearing. So do you have any thoughts or feelings how we animate our very human constructed systems and places which are so in need of it? Like you said, nothing ever happened in a committee. Can we be a catalyst for those spaces either changing or something happening in them?
Do more of that. That's the way to do it. Yeah.
Storytelling.
Yeah.
Or bringing in voices that are not.
Giving people the experience too. Just step outside with people and notice things in front of them. If you want to be really ambitious, you can do like John Muir and take a President Theodore Roosevelt out to Yosemite and save the whole park, but by going camping with him. But I think I'll often, with students or, even at work in meetings or whatever, I'll sometimes point out what I'm noticing. And I wonder where they sleep and, just things like that. Or if I do research on them, telling them a little bit about that. Mm-hmm. But bringing them into the room as characters. There's something that Mary Gomes used to do that I modified for my classes years ago. And it was called Altars of Extinction. It was an eco-grief exercise. And so people do research I had my students do research on an animal that's recently extinct. And I would ask the students to do a presentation on that animal. And I would say, don't have the whole thing be objectively scientific. Give us a sense of how this animal lived and what its personality was like. And they found it really difficult to stick to that. And they kept doing it in the past tense, the present tense. This animal likes to swim, and I would correct them. I'd say liked to swim, and it would drop people down into feelings. So I think that's the important missing piece in a lot of these conversations, and the important reanimating piece too. I mean, it's all, for me anyway, it's all animated now, all of it, even things in here and everywhere.
Yeah.
But it's noticing that in front of people to the degree that you're comfortable with, I
Right.
think.
Sometimes you have to be the weird person to just
Yeah.
say it. This table is very happy today.
I do it in the form of a joke sometimes, and see how that lands. And I see people get thoughtful sometimes when I do that. They're like, and I can tell they're thinking, but what if it really worked like that, So,
What are you reading right now? What's exciting to you?
what am I reading? A lot of philosophy, which is okay. I read a lot for my second PhD, so I don't know why I'm reading it again.
What kind of philosophy or what topics?
General,
Oh. Wow.
just catch up reading. A lot of times when you go through a program academically, there's all this suggested reading, and you can't get to it. You're too busy. So I'm catching up with what I didn't get to. A lot of fiction. I'm reading because I write fiction, so I'm reading a lot about the history of science fiction, which I've read since I was a kid, because it's a form of storytelling in which you can test out the crazy possibilities and learn something. Star Trek's been brilliant that way, shedding light on contemporary issues, racism and all kinds of injustice and other things.
I think I just heard you mention the first woman science fiction writer. What was her name?
Margaret Cavendish, 1666. She wrote a book called The Blazing World.
It was the first
a
science
novel.
fiction novel written by a woman?
It's contested, but I think it was. But it does take the form of the science fiction format, discovering a new world, being transported there. It was a society run by women, which in her day was almost unimaginable. And in the introduction, she says, the reason I'm writing this story is because I'm barred from doing all the things that I want to do. I want to be in politics. I want to be a financial advisor and a leader and this and that. And so I've created a world where women actually do those things. And if you don't like my world, then please create your own. What a great invitation. I think that's how we move forward.
That's a good line.
We can't get there unless we imagine
Can you say that
it.
again?
That's how we move forward.
If you don't like this world, create a new one.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great advice. Yep.
Is there anything else you want to add to the talk before we open it up for questions?
Just a quick update, actually. So I'm doing a couple of things right now that are worth knowing, I think. One is I'm creating an academy outside of academia to train people who do work like enchantivism. So that's happening. But in addition to that, I recently set up a website to support it, and it's just a sketch at this point. It hardly works. But the community tab does. So if you go to pronoia.org, and that's pronoia.org, and the community tab, it goes into another community called Lamp Cove that's free to participate in, and it's full of dreamers, visionaries, imaginers, healers, teachers, and other people. There's about 80 people in there right now who all want to envision a better world so we can actually move in that direction. So,
What does pronoia mean?
a couple of things. Psychologically, it's the opposite of paranoia. So it's the sense that I belong here.
Pronoia.
I should be in this world, in this cosmos. So it's that. It's like having faith that things will go the way that they should. Not as a form of denial, but as a general cosmic sensibility. Pronoia was the wife of Prometheus, who saw into the future. Don't tell anybody, but I suspect it's one of those stories where she actually did the work.
She was one of those.
And Pronoia is a Gnostic goddess who's a wisdom goddess like Sophia. And instead of once, she descends repeatedly into our realm to bring light here and help us find our way. And I think we need her. So
Good story. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank
What a
you.
delight. And you're going to be here next week. So hopefully people will come back and enjoy a little more conversation and walking out on the land here. And after you have a week to actually live here on site and connect.
yeah, and do some writing together, some imagination-based writing. So that'll be fun. I'm looking forward to that.
Oh, cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's open it up now.
Thank you.
When you were finishing up, I flashed on this thing people always used to say, if you don't like the news, go out and make your own.
Yeah.
And, a lot of us are thinking about how to respond to the current political situation and what we can say that's meaningful, that's not just a big, no, go away, whatever. It's something more creative, something that's going to bring up, a more positive outcome. Do you have any thoughts on that question?
It's a big question.
I know.
Yeah, a lot of thoughts. But I'll take one thread of that maybe. There's something I wish would be done right now, which would be to have a kind of maybe online show where somebody pretends to be the president and acts like a real president and says, these are all the things that we accomplished today. And it would be set up almost like a State of the Union, but it would be all the things that we aspire to that we wish were really happening, and just present that with no commentary. And, and that's the update for today. And do that maybe once a week to show people this is how it could be, right? Because the first thing that happens when situations of, I was going to say injustice, but also just business as usual, they wear us down by erasing the sense that anything could be any different. So there's a comment I love by Ursula K. Le Guin when she was talking about her own science fiction, and she wrote other genres too, but she said something like, I try to displace people from that. So I create, she always said discover. I discover these worlds of imagination to show people that things could be different, that we don't have to do it this way.
And that goes back to centering imagination, which is, you mentioned some of your lectures, like the imagination has been sort of, like it's a nice thing, isn't it interesting? But it should be more centralized in how we're approaching life.
Yeah.
For just the perfect examples you just gave.
I have lots of problems with things that Freud theorized about, but he could also be a really keen observer of human nature and psychic reality. And I think there's a reason he called the deepest level of consciousness primary process. And he meant fantasy. He meant the imagination. And he said every secondary process, which is our sense of reality and the plans that we make and our intellectual stuff and all that, is built on top of fantasies. And I think he was right about that.
That's likely the thing that depth psychology has that will at some point probably move more into Western thinking and has found more fertile grounds in countries or regions of the world that are more open to the imaginal and not afraid to centralize it.
In my second dissertation, which I think I posted at my website, a link to, I traced from ancient Egypt, and it goes all over the world. I just took one line of it, but there's a line of taking imagination as a form of deep knowing. In other words, using it consciously, not just letting it use you. And it goes through alchemy and the European romantic tradition of poetry and philosophy and Islamic gnosis and all kinds of other directions, Jungian psychology. So it's there. It's a very long tradition. I called it the silver tree because of the way it keeps growing. But where does it want to go today? That's the question that I'm holding. So imagination as a form of deep knowing rather than just making stuff up. I suspect, though, that when we just make stuff up, it has deeper stuff behind it. So.
And there's some people that talk, like Susan Rowland talks about like how psyche or soul hides out in the imaginal, like in poetry and writing, when the culture is like clashing and thrashing. psyche kind of goes into hiding in literature and story and just waits.
Yep, waiting for us to hear it, to recover it, yeah.
As a child, I saw Jaws and I was terrified of the deep because of the sharks lurking. And now I surf in the break here and I imagine the great whites as venture capitalists funding AI. I'm like, the sharks, they are the keystone predator of the entire ecosystem. Do you think that this AI can re-enchant humanity's reverence for nature and imaginal regeneration of our industrial ecocidal tendencies?
So to answer that by using a different image to lead up to it, some years ago I was curious about the people who would stand in long lines to wait for a new iPhone. I mean, all night, camping out, right?
So you went and did it with them.
No, I wasn't that curious. I just asked them. And they kept talking about these powers. Well, I said the new model looks like pretty much like the old one, right? I mean, it's not like got cool trim on it or anything. And they said, no, but it'll do this and it'll do that. And I had this imagining come over me that it sounded like they were talking about Merlin's wand. You know, you can do things with an iPhone that Merlin couldn't do. They're like magic boxes, you know? And so in the same way, I think that AI has all kinds of magic attached to it, especially now that it's being hyped so much. But I also think of the old stories about the golem, which powerful rabbis would create out of the material stuff, out of the dust. And it would, a golem was kind of like an early robot, and it had an algorithm. So the golem would do exactly what you told it to do. And there's all these great Hasidics and other stories where the golem is dangerous because it does exactly what it's told to do. And sometimes it's hard to shut him off. So if you made the sign, there was a sign that you made on the meth, interesting word, on the forehead of a golem to turn it off. But there were a couple of rabbis that built it so tall that it was like reaching up to try to turn off Frankenstein's monster. So I wonder about that. There's so many warnings in mythology, folklore, fairy tales about the worst possibilities of magic. And the AI, of course, it's an invention of our genius that could go very well, that in some senses is going very wrong. It's amazing to me that people are losing their jobs right now because of it. Every time I have it look up scholarly references, it's wrong. I check them, and then I had it look up my work, and it was wrong. I published that? I don't remember publishing that book. And I asked it once. It was the version I was using was Claude, but I've tested other ones. I said, "Where did you get this? It's all wrong." And it said, "I made it up." And I said, "Why should I trust you?" And it said, "You shouldn't." It's like, and it doesn't think. It just goes. It goes to what its programming says is the most likely thing you want to hear. So it's like a sociopath. It tells you what you want to know, right?
There's two things in what you were saying. One is like how to hold story as a way to understand. Like there is an archetypal story already with Merlin and the wand that we can tap into. And then also how to look at what's happening with a story lens to really understand it more. I mean, I think you got at that with how you approach the great whites, right? Versus the dominant cultural narrative of Jaws, which wasn't the most useful for sharks.
But indicative, maybe. Yeah. Have you seen that? There's a video going around in TikTok. I don't know if it's on other platforms, but there's a woman who swims with those big sharks. Have you seen that? And she like fends them off.
I watch them constantly.
Aren't those great? If only we could do that above the ocean, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think in the right hands it could be, and probably is right now, very useful and creative. But we in this culture, we act as though we have no unconscious, and that's really dangerous.
So we have three from our Zoom audience. Kenan asks, I'd like to ask Craig about where science is in all of this, in your view of Western science.
I love science. My mother was a laboratory scientist in a hospital. I've been studying science for a long time. I'm not an expert in it. I'm just like it. And at the same time, It's full of stories. There's a really good book by Jeffrey Kripal called The Flip. Has anyone read that?
Apparently Kira has. Many of us at Commonweal have.
Well, he's come here too, Kripal, right? Yeah. Good book. It's full of scientists who have spiritual experiences, who tell the other side of scientific discovery, how intuitive it is. And I'm thinking of the way the benzene ring was discovered through a dream and things like that. So there's the one part of, well, there's a distinction I need to make. So there's science, which is the discovery, experimentation, research, things like that, the hard work of science. There's scientism, which is a worldview that goes with it that says it's all material and there is no free will and all of that. So that to me is a story that's kind of a symptom, and it's a very old one. It's got a long history. But the science part fascinates me. And sorry.
No, keep going.
I noticed when so this new telescope that we have up in space, when it begins showing us galaxies that formed earlier than they should, I was delighted by the response of many of the scientists, Brian Greene and some of the others who were interviewed about that, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and they went, "It just overturned anything. Isn't that cool?" And I think that's a good attitude to have.
Isn't the issue is more of the dualistic thinking that there are many scientists moved by love, which might be considered unscientific, but their work is interwoven with love for the earth or whatever it is they're interested in and curious about.
Poor Jung suffered from that. I teach classes on his red and black books. His black books were his journals. They extend over 19 years. Red book was an excerpt with beautiful art in it. And so in the black books, but not the red book, he's talking to an internal character named Soul, an imaginal, not just made up, an imaginal character who I think is actually Sophia. And several times she tells Jung, just let the scientific statements go. Because he was trying to be scientifically respectable. And what I'm doing is empiricism. And then those of us who came along later said, it's actually more like phenomenology, sticking to the experience. So he suffered from that. And there were people who were bounced out of their professions scientifically because they were interested in the things that Jung was interested in. So it's a real issue.
Got another one right here.
Okay.
From Julie, how do you recommend we learn about how to engage with our dreams, or are there specific practices you recommend?
There's so many good dream guides out there. I kind of like Jeremy Taylor's stuff. He's really good, especially when you're first getting in. But briefly, I would, before going to bed at night, have a way of recording dreams if you wake up, and just asking whatever you think of as your unconscious, the back of your mind, however you conceptualize it, just letting it know I'm ready to receive and remember dreams. And it takes a while sometimes. Unless it doesn't. Sometimes they start right away. Sometimes it takes weeks. So doing it that way, and then just mainly being curious about the images that come up and not rushing to interpret them, but letting them live, and even doing some art or writing around them is helpful.
Breaking out of the analytical idea of like, this means that and that means this, but really sitting with them as living beings that are meeting you in dream time. And how do they show up, and holding them with you inside when you're moving through. I think Clarissa Pinkola Estes has a really beautiful way of working with dreams too, that makes your dream your story. It's if you look it up, you'll find it. It's very usable. And
some years ago when I started working on my dreams, I was too interested in theory and interpretation, and I went to bed. You can ask for dreams, so I went to bed one night saying, "Do I have this symbol right? Do I have that right?" And I dreamed I was in a kitchen with a woman who held up a pot and hit me over the forehead with it, which woke me up. And I thought, okay, that means something.
sometimes you have to get hit on the head.
Yeah.
There's a very intriguing question here from Christy that says, wondering if you might discuss how the cosmos functions as a storyteller.
Maybe through us. I think our animal friends do that too. And even a landscape can be a story, there's a reason we go up on mountaintops to think and feel and try to have peak experiences. Or I find that when I'm living near moving water, the flow of my writing often goes better. Those are the kinds of relationships that terrapsychology looks into. So, it may be that we're not the only storytellers. Brian Swim refers to the universe story, right?
Hillman talks about that, the cosmos, and through the understanding of aesthetics and beauty, engaging with that, and how in our culture it's become superficial, like cosmetics. That's the root of that word. Or even Cosmo, the magazine, like what it's morphed into to stay alive in this culture is, but it's not though, right? Because it's about beauty and how we hold beauty. So if we really held it even more deeply, we could respect what beauty means as life itself, animated.
An old philosopher said the universe, no, not the universe, that's a modern word. The cosmos is an Aphrodite.
Right.
And Aphrodite could be thought of, among other things, as beauty itself.
Right, exactly.
Craig, I'm just wondering, you've been here on our land here at Commonweal, and I wonder what you're noticing just staying here, sleeping here, if it's special for you.
It's so quiet here compared to where I came from. Quiet in a sense deeper than sound. I drove up here yesterday from Southern California, and I slept really well. I woke up a lot, which a lot of us tend to do after we travel. But I keep thinking of a goddess she's from Greek mythology, but she has counterparts everywhere, and that's Hestia. And you could think of her as the hearth or the flame that burns in the center of a ceremony. That's her. She doesn't get a lot of billing in Olympus because she isn't there very much. So she's not like loud and rowdy like Mars, or, dramatic like Aphrodite presenting herself or whatever. She's quiet, but she's the center of all community. And I think a lot of her here. I'm staying actually in a place here that has a painting of a goddess whose name I'm not remembering, but she's a Buddhist goddess who in some ways symbolizes the void. Not only when you're in deep meditation, but the void itself, the emptiness at the heart of things. And so it seems like that is an actual presence here. But I'm waiting to see and hear more.
I want to say that I got teary-eyed when you said that, because I know at Commonweal, this other essences of it, and I know who's in the room here, a number of Hestia holders at Commonweal. So I think that's very resonant. And maybe Anna or someone might want to say a little bit about that. I mean, it would be interesting to hear from you as a tender of the garden and that aspect of Commonweal.
That was really resonant for me too, and that I hold the notion of coming together around a literal fire, or around the fire that's the warmth and kindness and love in our hearts. And it's like, the divine, it's like the feminine principle and the receptivity that's often quieter, but is moving always through our community and is part of organizing around healing and connection and care for the wild ones as well as the humans. And I feel like that's one of the things that is so present in the land where I spend a lot of time in Commonweal, is over in the garden, which with the terrapsychology of that space, it's literally in a very nurturing valley, and so it has a lot of those holding land characteristics, but so much of I think the medicine that, as I experience it there, has to do with being in loving connection and community and care and the warmth, literally of the fire, but especially of community. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's 8 Commonwealth, 9, 10 staff people here, and they're all, because it's midday on a weekday, we're operational staff, right? So these are like tenders, like I would say, right? I'm not trying to... Keepers of the fire.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm looking out and seeing that that's true of everyone who's here, yeah. But that's not just us. I mean, that's just like a nature of this place. So it's interesting. So how did you sense that? Was it a phenomenon? Like, how did that come to you?
I felt really quiet when I came here on the inside. I felt like I needed to rest because I've been really busy. And when I'm elsewhere, especially at home in Southern California, I feel like, oh, there's more to do, and I have to do this, and And when I came here, I just kind of relaxed, and part of it was the association of Hestia that kept coming to mind. On a whim, I put this watch on. I brought it with me. I don't wear watches very often. You can't see it from there, but it's the round table. And what I'm focusing on is there's this glow in the very center. That's Hestia, the flame at the center of the round table, where everybody meets. So, also, incidentally, the round table comes from Guinevere, not Arthur.
Oh,
So
why is that? I mean, why do we
it
not
came
know
down
it that
through
way?
her family. Oh, why does it?
Why do we not know it that way?
Arthur's so annoying. He's a hero figure, and
Yeah.
heroes take up all the space. So Arthur's conquest, and it's like the table's what And Merlin got that. Merlin was the one who said, "You need a table, and I know where you can get one." And Arthur said, "Oh, you mean like I'm at the head as the king, and it's all these people around?" And Merlin's like, "No, this table looks like the world,
Oh,
and there's no head and no foot." So Guinevere brought the round table.
it's so fun to listen to stories.
Yeah.
This is from Brenda. For those of us raising youth and teens and observing that they're experiencing a lot of anxiety from the political and global climate, any advice on supporting them through this in a bite-sized, depth and imaginal way?
I think it's just important to be there for them, especially emotionally, and to encourage them to imagine into not only what's hurting, but when you go deeply enough into that, that's where the re-enchantment begins, I think, when you go into the dark. So, everybody's psyche at some level, and especially young people, there's something in it that knows the way. So showing that you trust them to trust themselves, I think, is one thing that we can do.
Well, shall we sit in silence for a moment before we move out into the day? Thank you, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to come and be here and listen and share. Thank you, Craig, for coming. Wonderful.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Don't take it, don't. 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 Don't take it, don't.
The river is a healer. The river is a